Title of my talk today is Physically Unclonable Function, a hardware security primitive for IoT security. So in this workshop, primarily you have been covering several aspects of hardware security, of IoT security, of IoT probably, and I will concentrate on IoT security. In particular, I will concentrate on the application of hardware security primitives called PUFs in IoT security. Okay, and I will go into the application and then I will go into some examples of PUFs and some threats on PUFs. So this is kind of the outline of the talk. First, I will discuss the concept of a PUF, the fundamentals, the motivation of PUF circuit design, what is the concept, the fundamental properties of PUFs, PUF quality metrics and application of PUFs in security and IoT security, and example PUF designs with arbiter PUF, ring oscillator PUF, and describe some challenges in PUF design, and then I'll describe attacks on PUFs. The types of attacks. Okay, two types of attacks I will describe. One is called a modeling attack on a circuit called arbiter PUF or APUF, and the other is a modeling attack on a circuit called ring oscillator PUF or ROPUF. These modeling attacks are completely computational attacks. As you will see, one of them rely on machine learning and the other rely on evolutionary computing. So what is the motivation for PUF circuit design? There are several motivations. One of the primary motivations was anti-counterfeiting of integrated circuits. This is itself a topic on which a lot of research has been going on, and I have also worked a little bit on. The issue is that counterfeit ICs constitute 30 to 40% of total ICs in circulation at any given point of time. By counterfeit IC, it means that ICs which are either produced illegally, okay, either cloned from other ICs, and most importantly, the most common example is ICs which have been actually part of a system earlier, but then it was discarded, and again it is being kind of used in another system. It is being resold as a new IC. Okay, it's claimed to be a new IC and sold. So the estimated business is huge. In 2008, it was estimated that this is about $1 billion per day. This is 2021. So as you can guess, probably it has become a magnitude higher. Okay, so there are several threats that come along with this and this fake counterfeit ICs. I will not go into these details because today's talk is not on that topic. But it is especially relevant for a country like India that imports almost all of its silicon electronics. Okay, in India, we do not have too much of chip manufacturing. There is only one silicon manufacturing facility in Chandigarh and maybe some others in some small facilities of DRDO and maybe some academic institutions, but that's it. So they do not do any industry scale silicon manufacturing, especially the advanced technology silicon manufacturing. So every IC essentially that we are using in deployed systems in India, ranging from very large telecommunication equipments to personal handheld laptops and smartphones and tabs, etc. Everything is imported. Okay, and in a country with 140 crore people, you can guess how much of that is actually happening. Now the question is, can we have a lightweight hardware security primitive that can act as a fingerprint generator to uniquely identify each IC instance? This is the question. Next application area is lightweight security protocol for Internet of Things. This is Internet of Things devices typically are energy and area constrained. I believe since this workshop is dedicated on IoTs, other speakers have also talked of this particular feature of IoT devices, which makes it particularly challenging to adopt many different ideas that you can use in many other areas of computing directly to an IoT context, because they are extremely energy and area constrained. Okay, the energy constraint issue is like, you have portable devices like laptops, but then you know that at the end of the day or in the middle of the day, you would have the opportunity to again charge the battery, and then you will again have full battery power, and that again will last you for a few hours. In IoTs, often many devices are such, especially sensor type devices, which are deployed in remote locations where recharging the battery is not possible, and also changing the battery very frequently is probably also not possible. So you have to think of security protocols which usually rely on, I mean, the traditional cryptographic security protocols usually rely on very heavy public key cryptography often. OK, so those computations consume enormous amount of energy per computation. So you perform a traditional authentication protocol 10 times with your device, and you find the battery is already it has half drained. OK, so that is something that cannot be allowed. So can we have lightweight hardware security primitive to allow secure but inexpensive security protocols? Unfortunately, today we would not have time to go into details of these protocols, but I have worked on security protocols based on PUFs. That's one of my research areas in which I work on. I will give you a glimpse of very basic security mechanisms of authentication, which can also be adopted in IoTs, but directly discussion of protocols, their proofs of security, etc. This is a different completely, I mean, that's probably can be the topic of another day or couple of days of lecture. So if any of you are interested about the details, please contact me over my email and I can point you to the relevant literature. Third motivation might be a keyless cipher design. Cipher means a cryptographic algorithm, okay, an encryption scheme. Now the point is that these most cryptographic algorithms rely on some sort of secret. There are primarily two types of ciphers. One are symmetric key algorithms, where the sender and the receiver both have the same secret key, and the other are asymmetric key algorithms, where the sender and the receiver each, okay, might have a pair of keys. And say if I just concentrate on one party, he or she has one pair of keys, one of which is called the public key, which can be published to the rest of the world, and the other is called private key, which has to be kept secret. So again, we find a scenario where there is at least one piece of secret information that has to be kept secret all the time. Otherwise, the scheme does not work. Now, can we think of a keyless cipher where there won't be any explicit key? There might be a secret, some secret information, but that secret information would be part of the system itself, and it can be extracted from the system at any point of time we want, but it won't be in the form of an explicit key stored in a, say, a non-volatile memory, like say a flash ROM or something. Why is this important? Because if you store the key separately, secretly, there is always the chance that somebody might try to steal the key from the location at which you have kept it. OK, so this has to be taken care of. So these cipher keys have been leaked successfully through implementation specific attacks, for example, side channel attacks, fault attacks, etc. So this has already happened. OK, lots of such attacks are known. I believe some previous speakers have also spoken of this. So if we see if you get rid of the key, then the question of these attacks which aim at kind of revealing the key, the question of that attacks also do not arise. They become irrelevant. Okay. Now, everybody knows that the ciphers that are in common use, for example, for block ciphers, AES is a very common and secure choice. Nobody has been able to break it directly mathematically, but that does not guarantee that AES has not been broken. It has been broken by many researchers using different techniques, primarily through side channel attacks, fault attacks, etc. So can we have a keyless cipher where such attacks become irrelevant? That's the question. Now, what is a physically unclonable function or PUF? It can be seen to be a fingerprint generator for an IC. Okay, so what is a fingerprint generator? I will come to that. A PAF is a challenge response mechanism in which the mapping between an applied input, that is a challenge, and the corresponding observed output, that is a response, is dependent on the complex and variable nature of physical material. Okay, so there is something called process variation that is actually plagues all silicon manufacturing. So what is process variation? Process variation is kind of a phenomenon by which the devices that you make, they do not follow exactly the properties that you want, but their properties vary randomly around the expected properties. Okay, so suppose those of you who are familiar with basics of transistor MOSFET behavior, there is something called a threshold voltage, the voltage, the minimum voltage required to make the transistor on. So this threshold voltage in modern devices might be on the order of, say, between 0.1 to 0.2 volt. Okay, but this might, instead of, so you say you want the target threshold voltage to be 0.17 volt, but say it actually comes to be 0.20 volt or 0.15 volt. Anything can happen. And this, why does this happen? Because the devices have become so small that their manufacturing is no longer very well controlled at the current technology. Okay, the devices have become less than 10 nanometer, 14 nanometer, 11 nanometer, 7 nanometer, all this type of technologies are very common. Products are available in the market at these technologies. So they have become so small that it has become very, very difficult to control their manufacturing. And so this process variation is something that we have to live with. There is no other option. Okay. Now, the challenge response mapping is unclonable. And what is the challenge? What is a PAF? It is a kind of a, you can look at it as a digital circuit, a Boolean function which has an m-bit input and an n-bit output. Okay. Now, this m-bit input, n-bit output mapping, or the truth table of this PAF instance is unique. Ideally, no other PAF instance that you manufacture will have the same truth table. Try to understand the concept of a PAF instance. It is separate from the concept of a PAF type. What we are talking of is the truth table for any two silicon instances, even of the same PAF type. As we will see very soon, there are several PAF types. Okay, but the truth tables of even two instances of the same PAF type will be different. Okay, this is similar to the fingerprint of human being. So even if there are twins, okay, in human beings, even if there are twins, these twins will have twin brothers or sisters. They will have their fingerprints to be different, although they might look very, very similar. Sometimes there are identical twins. Identical twins are those whose genetically they are also exactly similar. Okay, but still their fingerprints are different. That's why fingerprint is more or less a very good biometric identifier. So now I want an identifier for every IC that I am manufacturing, so that every IC instance that I am manufacturing, that will have a PAF type biometric. We have a PAF circuit which will have a unique truth table unique to it, which will act as the identifier. So you might ask that why do we need it? ICs, every IC that you buy can have a serial number, and that serial number is unique. Yes, but this serial number can be faked. For example, somebody might collect your picture or copy a picture from a soft copy of, say, your Aadhaar card and generate a fake Aadhaar card where your picture is kept, but the names and addresses, date of birth, father's name, everything is completely different. But that will not happen with your finger if your fingerprint data is there. That's why when you go to like buy a SIM card or so, oftentimes your fingerprint biometric data that is stored along with your Aadhaar card data, that is compared to check that yes, the person who wants to buy the SIM by submitting his Aadhaar card data is actually the person who is claimed in the Aadhaar card. This is not fake document or a fake person, because that biometric is very difficult to fake. So this is what we want. We want an instance specific behavior, and along with that it should be unclonable.
சரி எடுத்துட்டு வந்தாரு.
அது கொடுத்தாதான் ரெமுனரேஷன், போய் எடுத்துட்டு வாமா.
அப்படி ஒண்ணு ரெமுனரேஷன் எனக்கு தேவையில்லை.
அது கொடுத்தாதான்.
அதை எடுத்துட்டு வர இருங்க. ஐயோ என்ன இடத்துல நான் போட்டேன்.
I can hear some voices.
I am just muting. Okay, just 1 minute. Okay, now you can start.
Okay, so the challenge response should also, this mapping or this truth table should also be unclonable. What is unclonable? This is a very important property. This means, and this is the property which gives it the name, the circuit the name. This property says that suppose you have designed such a circuit in silicon, implemented it in silicon, and you have characterized its truth table. Okay, now you cannot manufacture another circuit in silicon with the same characteristics, with exactly the same truth table. You cannot make a clone of this silicon. So you might have heard of Dolly the sheep, which was the first organism to be cloned. Okay, genetically cloned from another, artificially cloned, and human cloning apparently has also happened, and many people are not happy about it. Okay, but what we are saying is this electronic cloning will be impossible to do. Okay, we do not have any technology currently where this electronic cloning of a puff behavior is possible. You can manufacture other ICs, similar ICs, instances. Okay, but the puff circuits that they will have inside them, those ICs, several ICs, their behaviors will be different from each other. Okay, so as we mentioned that these puff circuits usually try to take advantage of the unavoidable process variation, unavoidable and unpredictable manufacturing process variation effects of modern deep submicron MOSFET devices. Usually this is a problem. Process variation is a challenge, but puffs try to take advantage of them. Okay, and one good thing is that the impact of process variation become more pronounced as the technology advances. Like the impact of process variation at 500 nanometer technology is less than the impact of process variation at say 7 nanometer technology. Okay, fine. Now there are some properties of an ideal puffs. So it should be unique, it should be easily evaluatable, it should be reproducible. By reproducible it means that repeatedly when you apply the same input X to it, you will observe the same output Y. Okay, maybe slight errors, small errors, but more or less you will find the same output. So if you think that X is 1 bit and Y is 1 bit, then you might ask what is because Y output Y, if it is 1 bit, it has only one value, two values, 0 and 1. So how can it be that up to a small error? Well, it's up to a small error on average. You will characterize for several values of X, and the characteristics won't match exactly for all the values of X, but it will remain constant on average, say 95 to 99% of times, etc. Okay, this is also called the reliability property. We will discuss it very soon. They should be unclonable, as I said. They should be one way. I will come to the unpredictable property last because it is important. They should be one way. That means given output Y, it will be impossible to predict anything about the input X. They should be tamper evident, which means that if you try to physically alter some puff circuit, it will permanently change into some other puff circuit whose outputs with a high probability will be different from the previous puff circuit. Okay, so the tampering will be very, very evident. Now paths should be unpredictable. Let us try to understand what this means. This means that, well, there is a mathematical notation that has been written that suppose there is a set of tuples xi comma yi, which is the response of the path instance when you apply input xi to it. So these xi yi tuples are given and there is a set of this. Now it will be hard to predict the output response for an input xc when xc is a random challenge which does not belong to this set. Okay, so what this means is you have been given a large truth table. Okay. The puff input number of bits of input n that was denoted by n in the previous slide. Sorry, m. So this inputs is can be very large, can be 64, 128, etc. So as you can guess, the truth tables are also very, very large. Now suppose you have been given a very small fraction of the truth table. Randomly you pick up some entries of the truth table and some corresponding outputs of the truth table and it is given to you. Given this, it will be ideally, it will be impossible for you with any certain degree of probability of success to predict any other truth table output for some input which which was not part of the data that you have seen. So those of you who are familiar with machine learning, I guess all of you nowadays are, because machine learning is a very hot topic, are familiar with the concept of machine learning. It is something like this. Say you have a training data set. OK, in this training data set, you have some puff input challenges and responses, these pairs. That is your training data set. Based on this, somebody says, build me a mathematical model of the puff so that it can predict the response accurately for any other input challenge. That should be ideally impossible. OK, in a good puff. However, as we will see, unfortunately, that is not the case. There are some very well-known types of puff which actually can get you this information. OK, it can build a model which will be able to predict the puff output very nicely. Fine. So now let us see. Uniqueness. OK, so there are several quality metrics for puff. Uniqueness, reliability and uniformity are the three most common, which I will describe. A uniqueness says that you take a set of challenges C and you apply them to the different puff instances. Puff 1, puff 2, puff 3 means different puff instances. And the responses, you will get a set of responses. C and R here are sets of challenges and responses. It's not one challenge and one response. OK, so typically you will find that the response sets of the different puffs are different from each other, even if the same challenge is applied. So this is uniqueness because every truth table of the every puff instance should be unique. Now reliability. What is reliability? Well, you apply the same challenge, but you characterize now only one puff instance, say called puff 1, and you characterize it multiple times. Today, tomorrow, day after tomorrow, or today after 10 hours, after 20 hours, etc. And ideally, you should find that the puff instance should have 100% reliability. Perfect reliability means the responses should be the same every time you have applied the challenge. OK. So why is this important? Well, reliability is uniqueness is important because if another person, say I will describe in terms of this fingerprint. If another person can have the same fingerprint, then it's a problem, right? Why is fingerprint a popular biometric identifier? Because another person will never have the same fingerprint. It is unclonable because even given a person and his fingerprint, it is impossible to clone another person with the same fingerprint. Okay, that is not possible. And it is reliable. It's not that every morning you wake up, your fingerprint changes. If that had happened, fingerprint would not have become a biometric identifier. Have you ever thought while say a passport photo, the photo of a face, why is that not a biometric identifier? Ultimately, it's kind of a record of a biometric feature, right? Your face. Why is that not a biometric identifier? Because it is very, very easy to change how you look like, how your face looks like. And naturally, it changes over time. It changes a lot over time. Okay, men they might develop a beard, they might develop a mustache, they might get rid of a beard and the mustache, and the look might become completely different. Similarly for women. Okay, so the problem is that you only select those to become biometric identifiers which you know are reliable over time, which will not change in the lifetime of the person, possibly, like say fingerprint. There is an iris scan also, which is a more advanced biometric identifier, but that is also available in Western countries in many places, and in India also probably in some high security areas or some high technology offices, etc. Okay, you have iris scan of the eye. So that is a biometric ID because these identifiers do not change over lifetime. Similarly, the PUF responses should not change from time to time. Unfortunately, this reliability thing does not hold in real PUFs. Okay. These PUF circuits, their responses actually vary over time based on small changes of voltage, supply voltage, electrical noise, or say your thermal temperature change, etc. Different things can make the output responses to be different. Okay. Now, given this thing, people have come up with schemes which are based on error correction codes. A layer is built on the circuits based on error correction codes, which actually ensure 100% reliability. Okay, for this pass. Effectively 100% reliability. I will not go into it because, but it's not a very difficult scheme to understand once you know about it. Just that some extra characterization data has to be stored if you want to correct the response of the PUF, even in a noisy, electrically noisy or at a different temperature kind of an environment. Okay. The uniformity is another property of the truth table. It is simply the ratio of 0 and 1s obtained in the responses of the PUF truth table. For example, the uniformity of the XOR function, exclusive OR function, is 0.5 because if you see its truth table, exactly 50% of the outputs are 0 and 50% of the outputs are 1. The uniformity of the AND function is 1 divided by 2 power n, where n is the number of inputs to the AND gate. Okay, why? Because there is only one entry of the truth table out of the 2 power of n entries, which is at logic 1. So the AND function is very poor uniformity. XOR has better uniformity, but XOR, so basically you want that the truth table of PUFs should be kind of more similar to XOR functions than AND or OR, this type of highly nonlinear and very, very unbalanced truth table functions. Okay. Now, why are PUFs important? Because in a security scenario without PUF, the trusted party has to embed and test the secret key in a secure location. For example, an NVM is a non-volatile memory. but the intrinsic properties of device is used to generate a secret key. And EEPROM might be used, that non-volatile memory, which will add additional complexity to manufacturing because the process might be different. But the PUF is built in using circuits which are part of the same IC itself. So no separate technology is required. Adversaries may physically extract the secret key from non-volatile memory by different techniques. However, for PUF, the key is really deleted after usage in decryption or encryption processes. Means because there is no explicit key. Okay, so as if you can say the key again goes back and hides. The key never comes out explicitly. Okay. Now let us see how can PUFs help, and this example is with respect to it can be with respect to ICs, it can be with respect to IoTs, anything. Okay, so suppose I will give this example. So here primarily it was described to prevent counterfeit ICs, but I can adapt it to give you an example of an IoT security. So a fundamental issue with IoT security is mutual authentication, which means that there are two devices. They want to communicate with each other. And how can they be sure, or at least one of the parties be sure, that it is actually talking with another party which claims that some identity? Okay, when you perform communication over the internet, say you want to do net banking, okay, so you want to log into some bank's website. This type of operations, how can you be sure that the website you are accessing corresponds actually to the bank? Because these URLs might be spoofed and somebody might set up a bank website, fake bank website, which looks exactly like your authentic bank website. So how can you be sure as a customer? So the most common way in which this is solved is through something called security certificates. Okay, digital certificates. These certificates essentially are data structures which describe the public key of your bank server, which can be used in public key cryptography, and binds it with the identity of the bank. And these digital certificates are issued by trusted certificate issuers who are respected all over the world. Okay, so for example, say VeriSign, VeriTrust. These are some VeriTrust. I think there is some companies which do this in charge money. I think there are also some free options. I don't know whether commercial entities actually use these free options, but there are these commercial, companies which issue these certificates in exchange of a fee, and these certificates have validity. So this certificate might remain valid for 2 years, and then this might become obsolete. And then again, the company has to pay money to the certificate provider to renew his certificate. Now, if you are accessing a secured web page, HTTPS, okay, you can click on the browser address bar, and at least in Chrome it is possible, and they will give you some basic information about the validity of the website that you are visiting, whether it has a proper security certificate, who issued that certificate, for how long is that certificate valid, etc., etc. So your browser, while connecting to the web server, performs a SSL handshake with that web server to make sure that it is communicating with the correct party, and then exchanges some information which later on allows all the traffic flow between you and the bank server to be completely encrypted, so that any eavesdropper third party who wants to eavesdrop the communication channel will only get encrypted information and would not be able to do much. Okay. So SSL operates at kind of the transport layer of networks with some parts probably, I mean, it's kind of an application transport. It operates in both the layers, you can say. And there are also alternative security mechanisms, for example, IPsec, which operates at the network layer. So to provide security. Now the problem with adopting this type of technique straightforward way in IoTs is that, well, first of all, these communications that happen during say SSL or this type of things are quite cumbersome. Multiple communications happen, energy might get energy spent in these communications, and cryptographic operations might need to be done, which results in additional energy usage. Instead, can you kind of allow this authentication, at least in the approach that has been proposed here, can you allow most of this work to be done by say a central server, okay, which will perform all this on behalf of you. Okay, IoT nodes are also sometimes so short-lived that it doesn't make much sense to issue them a security certificate full-fledged, because the certificate has to be managed. And how many certificates will you distribute? The number of IoT devices is supposed to be hundreds of billions. Already probably they are hundreds of billions. Okay, so management of security certificates in actual network communication which uses the internet, there is something called public key infrastructure or PKI that plays a role in handling all these security certificates and managing them. Here it is very, very difficult to adopt directly. So what you try to do is try to adopt an alternative hardware based mechanism that will let you do authentication, but it won't be that difficult. Okay, so suppose there is a central server which has the information of the different PUF instances. Now later on there is an instance. Say that instance, there is an instance A which has a PUF inside it. PUFs are small circuits, although I said that they have 64 or 128-bit inputs. As you will see, by their structure, they are usually manageable. It's not, even if there are 64-bit input circuit, it is still not that big compared to say a microprocessor or so. So it can easily fit inside your circuit. Now suppose such an authentic device A has a PUF circuit inside it. Okay, before it was released in the market or before it was deployed, several challenges were applied to it and the responses were noted down in a secret database. Okay, corresponding responses were noted down and this was kept secret at an authentication server database. And then this was deployed. Later on, somebody has raised a question about the identity of some device which claims that this is device A, which claims it is device A. How to now kind of come up with this? How to be sure that answer this question that whether this is actually device A? So the central server kind of tries to solve this problem on behalf of the party which has doubt about the identity of A. So the central server asks device, the party which is claiming to be device A, please give me the response corresponding to this challenge, some challenge in its database, and it gives an answer. It notes down the answer and compares with the response that was stored in its database. Then it applies the next challenge and again notes down the response and compares it with whatever it had in its database. Say it asks the question 10 times and 9 times out of 10, the response matches the question that was asked. In that case, the authentication server is happy. He says that, well, this guy has been able to correctly answer 9 out of 10 times of the questions that I asked him. So he seems to be the correct path. Because if he had not been the correct path, given the properties of paths that two path instances have very, very dissimilar characteristics, it would not have been able to predict the correct response that is stored in my secret database. Okay, so you might have watched these gangster movies, okay, either in Hollywood or Bollywood movies. So in this, sometimes in these gangster movies, this concept of challenge and response is actually used. For example, suppose there is a secret meeting of the gangsters that is going on, okay, in a kind of a mafia gang, large gang. Now somebody wants to enter that meeting, he has to say some magic word to the security person who is securing the door. Or the security guard might ask him a question and he has to give the correct answer. And then he goes past the first door. Then at the second door again he is asked a different question and he has to give another answer. If at any point of time he cannot answer the question or gives an incorrect answer, he is disallowed to go in any further. So this is kind of similar, that I will ask you 10 questions or maybe 50 questions or 100 questions in the form of challenges. You tell me your responses and I will match your responses to the responses I expect. If you match me 90, 95, maybe 100% of the times, I am happy. If you cannot match me, say more than 90% of times, I will say that, well, this does not seem to be the path. Now, why did they not make it 100% mandatorily, just to be perfectly sure? Well, in spite of error correction, code mesh mechanisms, etc., there is always a possibility that the paths will not have imperfect reliability and its answer will be slightly different from the expected answer. So this is the reason why it is not kept at 100% match requirement. It is kept up at about 90% to 95% match requirement. So at current state of the art, it is said that 90 to 95% of challenges are answered correctly, means that path has passed authentication. So this one device was authenticated with the help of a central server. So another device has to be authenticated. So it has to undergo a similar communication mechanism with the central server. Now in recent years, even from our group and also some other research groups around the world, mutual authentication protocols without the need of a central server or with minimum participation of a central server, central authentication agency, have been proposed. So those are more complicated schemes, so I will not go into them. Like, just to understand the mathematical structure of those protocols, it will take me probably a few hours to explain, because there are so many different concepts. Public key cryptography is used, hash functions are used, and so many other things are used. So I'll not go into it, but this is a simple path-based authentication scheme that I just now presented. It can be used for private key and public key pair generation also, but there are many other ways also to present it. So again, I will not spend too much time on this. Now, this is a very interesting concept that was proposed quite some time back in a paper in the AsiaCrypt conference in 2009. That's like more than 10 years back. What he proposed was kind of revolutionary. He proposed a keyless cipher. Okay, completely keyless cipher. There is no key in the entire cipher. Now, it sounds unbelievable that how can there be a cipher which does not have any key? Now, try to understand the structure. So this structure is, this L and R is two halves of the plain text. So your plain text that you want to encrypt has been taken and it has been broken up into two halves. Say 128-bit plain text, if you take, it has been broken up into two halves, L and R, okay, left and right of 64 bit each. And then you perform a substitution and permutation, or well, this is kind of permutation and repeated XORing. So this is a kind of a very common structure in block ciphers. So in the substitution boxes, usually S boxes are parts of any cipher, which gives you nonlinearity, and those boxes sit in the central parts. But now instead of the S boxes, you have now put this puff instances shown as puff1, puff2 and puff3. And finally, you generate ciphertext out of two halves of the ciphertext, X and Y. You combine them to get the entire ciphertext. Okay. Now, along with in the first stage, you also input a random value R and everything. This circled, this cross circles are actually XOR, multi-bit XORs. And so there are repeated XORings, and the puffs gives the repeated outputs, and then those are kind of swapped, and then again puff happens. Why only 3 rounds are shown? Well, there is a famous result by Luby and Rakoff that the randomized this 3-round permutation network. Okay, this is sufficient. 3 rounds are sufficient to have a pseudo-random kind of behavior at the output. So this result is there. That is very useful result. Now these round functions, basically the S boxes etc. have been replaced by the puff instances, and if you see, there is no key. Okay, there is in this entire thing there is no key other than the small random value that was there. Okay, now the question is, why is there no key? Or how can it work? How will it, why is this secure even without a key? Well, because the adversary who is observing the ciphertext does not have the puff instances with him or her, he would not be able to construct the this structure and extract the key. Okay, this is not possible. He cannot perform the same computation to extract the plain text. Now these can also be, this is kind of a Feastel structure, so this can also be used in the same structure, can be kept, and this puff3, puff2, puff1 in this order. If you apply the puffs from output to input, you will get back the plain text at the receiver. But the receiver must have this puff3, puff2, puff1, these 3 puffs with them, because by definition puffs cannot be cloned. So how will the receiver have these puffs? Do you understand? The receiver needs to have the puff, otherwise it cannot simply just decrypt. Okay, so this is, the scheme is very attractive. It does not involve any extra key. If the puffs have good nonlinearity, which most puffs have, then this scheme is secure. But why is it inconvenient? It is inconvenient because if the puffs cannot be cloned, then you have to physically transport the puff hardware instances at the receiver to decrypt the plain ciphertext. Okay, just think about it. You are sending a encrypted plain text from point A to point B, and the receiver at B cannot decrypt it, saying to A that you have a secret which I must also have to decrypt this. Please give me your puff circuits, only then I'll be able to decrypt it. That doesn't make much sense actually, right? So that's why this scheme never caught up. Okay, now I come to the first example called an arbiter puff or a puff. So now I will cover 1 or 2 examples of puffs, and then I will discuss attacks on them. Okay, the arbiter puff has several 2-port networks connected one after the other. The entire chain of these 2-port networks ends at an D flip-flop. The 2-port networks are very simple. They can act as path swapping switches. They have 1-bit control, which either allows the signals to go straight from the input port to the output ports, or they allow the signals to cross over. Don't get confused that there is an electrical short circuit because these blue lines cross each other. Okay, there is no electrical short circuit. It just shows that the node connectivity of the nodes when this input control bit changes from 0 to 1. This is not a very difficult. This path swapping switch, each of these can be built using two input 2 to 1 muxes. 2 to 1 muxes. So just do it as a small exercise that you try to implement a digital circuit which, given a control bit or input bit of one bit, it can either make two signals go straight or it can swap their connectivities. OK, so it's not very difficult to do. So you cascade a series of them, then you short the inputs of the first stage, and you apply a step waveform here. Now this step waveform basically divides into 2 parts at the 2 input ports of the first stage, and then these waveforms propagate along the paths. Now when this propagate along the path, the actual path that the 2 signals take depend on the combination of zeros and ones that you have applied across this chain of path swapping switches. Okay. Say for example, if all the bits are zeros, then at every point they will crisscross. Sorry, if all the bits are 0, then every point they will go straight. Okay, so the signal which enters at the top port will come out also of the output top port, and the signal which enters at the bottom port similarly will come out through the output bottom port. However, based on a combination of ones and zeros that you apply at this, here actually n+1 challenge bits are shown, but that's fine. I mean, probably you could have written n. It should have started with C1 up to Cn, but anyways, it doesn't matter. Depending on these combinations, the signals take different routes. Sometimes they go straight, sometimes they cross over, and finally they reach the 2 output ports. So now at the 2 output ports of the final stage, because each path, although they are geometrically of the same length, with very careful design, you can ensure that the geometrical length of each of these paths are the same. The paths have different delays, okay, because of process variation. As a result, these delay differences keep on accumulating across the stages. Okay, so there is a small delay difference between the 2 paths taken in stage 1 plus the delay difference for 2 paths taken in stage 2, plus in this way all the delay differences gets accumulated. Finally, the resultant delay difference okay, determines what value is this arbiter path actually samples. For example, if your bottom signal reaches first, which is input to the clock, the upper clock edge has come to the clock port, but in the top port it is still 0. In that case, 0 will be sampled and your response will be 0. However, if the top signal reaches here first and then the clock signal comes, then the clock edge will sample 1 and then your output response will change from 0 to 1. In this case, you will get 0. So there are 2 power n possible paths. So there are 2 power n challenges for each of which you will get a response. Once you get a response, you reset the circuit and again apply the pulse waveform at the input, and in this way you continue. Okay, this is a very simple structure, regular structure, reasonably simple to understand operation, but it is extremely susceptible to machine learning based modeling, as we will see. The ring oscillator path I will come to later. There is an example, the SRAM path, simple SRAM path, which basically this is kind of the circuit diagram of a 6 transistor modern SRAM cell. Here the value that you get, stored by default when you switch it on can either be logic 1 or logic 0. So that is kind of a puff behavior. Okay, in that case, the challenge is the address of this cell and the response is the kind of the output that you get the default value. Okay, most SRAM implementations actually have a explicit mechanism which on power on makes all the bits 0. Okay, so it writes zeros at every location inside the cell, inside the SRAM module. Okay, so what are the challenges in PUF design? Traditional CAD tool based IC design flow is quite difficult to directly use in PUFs. Because first of all, you always simulate your design to check that it is performing correctly. Here, what is the correct behavior is very, very difficult to explain. For example, suppose you are designing a digital gate, say the circuit for an AND gate, and you design some circuit, you simulate its behavior and you find that the truth table of that circuit that you have designed is not matching the truth table of an AND gate. So then you know that, well, some mistake I must have made, which has led to this truth table of my circuit being different from the truth table of a standard AND gate. So, and you must go back and debug your design to correct it. For a PUF, this question of what is the correct truth table of a PUF does not make any sense. Do you ever ask this question? What is the correct fingerprint of a human being? What is the expected fingerprint of a human being? This question does not have any meaning because there is no expected fingerprint of any human being. It is an unique characteristic of every human being. So what you are designing, whether it is the correct circuit or whether you have made any mistake, it is very, very, very difficult to say. Then process variation cannot be simulated very nicely. Okay, even I mean there is a lot of progress, but it is very difficult to simulate. Okay, it can be simulated, but it's difficult. Okay, then FPGA based PUF implementation is very, very difficult, especially SRAM PUF, because all bits in FPGAs SRAMs. The FPGAs are full of SRAMs, but the moment you first switch it on, all bits are made zeros. So the PUF behavior is destroyed. Then the routing and placement of the blocks have to be very perfectly controlled. For example, in this Arbiter PUF circuit that I designed, you must ensure that every interconnect length, the blocks are placed perfectly side by side. There is no additional interconnect length in the top and bottom paths, etc. That is very difficult to design, especially if you have used the Vivado tool for the modern tool for from Xilinx. It has made it even more difficult. It was already difficult and it has made it even more difficult because it doesn't give that much of control to the designers to perfectly control all placement and routing features. So if your routing is not symmetric, then you introduce bias and then the quality of your statistical quality of your PUF degrades. Okay, there are several types of attacks. So now I come to attacks on PUFs. Okay, so till now we have described some things about PUFs which seem very nice. We have seen examples of, we have described ideal properties of PUFs, example of PUF circuits, applications of PUFs. Now let us come to threats on PUFs. Today, maybe you have attended talks where there are threats on cryptographic implementation, cipher implementations have been described, right? Which basically it shows that your cipher might be secure mathematically, but they are not perfectly secure. Okay, I mean their implementations can be attacked. Okay, similarly PUFs can be attacked. So one is the brute force attack. To save every challenge response pair, to fill up the entire truth table of a PUF. That is not possible. Just like for a cryptographic circuit, it is not possible to have stored every input plain text and for every possible key to store the output. That is similarly, it is because it requires exponential space on the number of puff inputs. Okay, replay attacks. If the eavesdropper records challenge response pairs and play them back, it is possible, but those can also be prevented if there is a randomization parameter and if you do not reuse the challenge response pairs frequently. Now, primarily, we will try to concentrate on modeling attack or machine learning based modeling attack, which takes a challenge response pair as a training set and tries to build a model which can very accurately predict the rest of the truth table of a puff. So there is a model called a linear delay model of Arbiter puff. For the sake of time, I will not go into the mathematical details, but this was first derived by in a master's thesis from MIT. In fact, the same people who designed this circuit also designed this attack. What they showed is the problem of predicting the output of an Arbiter puff can be translated into the SVM classification problem of machine learning in an n+1 dimensional space where n is the number of input challenge bits to that Arbiter puff. For example, if n is 64, then in a 65 dimensional space, you need to find a separating hyperplane to classify some things which will tell you the response. Okay, so this is the problem. Now, SVM is a well-known algorithm. Its implementations are widely available even as library, straightforward library function calls in packages, machine learning packages, Python machine learning packages, MATLAB, all these things. So it's not very difficult to launch. Okay, the features that are used is called a parity vector, which is again not very difficult to calculate. One thing is the challenges have to be bipolar encoded, which means the +1 bits have to be encoded as 1 and the 0 bits have to be encoded at -1. Provided you do that, you can do this. Now, many people have attacked this Arbiter puff. So another attack is logistic regression based. Logistic regression is actually similar to SVM. If a problem, I mean, it is solvable easily by SVM, logistic regression usually is also be able to solve it. Okay, so it has like reported like 64-bit Arbiter puffs have been modeled with 99.9% accuracy using 18,000 challenge response pairs, etc., etc. XOR Arbiter, lightweight Arbiter puffs are like different other more robust circuits, but still it is they are breakable. And in our lab also, and many labs around the world, many research groups around the world. Even I believe, say, Professor Bivashen, who is conducting the workshop in his lab also, they are experts in this puff design and implementation and characterization. Many groups around the world have seen that yes, this can be done. This can be attacked. Okay, so like this, since like long for the last 20 years, these are known. Both from simulated puffs and also from silicon ASIC puffs and FPGA puffs, they have been broken. Now let me come to ring oscillator puff and describe an attack on a ring oscillator puff. A ring oscillator puff is also a digital kind of a puff which works in the following way. You apply some n-bit challenge to two large multiplexers. Each of these multiplexer is a 2 power n to 1 multiplexer, where the select signal is n-bit and the number of data inputs is 2 power n. That's like how multiplexers work, right? So when you apply a particular select signal, the challenge, the top multiplexer, and there are two such multiplexers. The top multiplexer and the bottom multiplexer selects two different ring oscillators as inputs. What are ring oscillators? You take odd number of inverters in series and you just put them in a ring, it becomes a ring oscillator. Okay, here one of the inverters has been shown to be in the ring has been shown to be a NAND gate because there is a control signal, but essentially an odd number of inverters in series. Then there is a buffer inverter at the forward. You can ignore this also. But this is how ring oscillators work. This is very easily you can generate these clock-like waveforms by this. Now, because of process variation, the frequency of oscillation of these ring oscillators of these clock-like waveforms is slightly different from each other. Okay, they should have been ideally exactly the same, but the exact sameness does not happen in practice because of process variation. So the two multiplexers have selected two different ring oscillators, and their oscillation frequencies are slightly different. These two ring oscillators clocks drive to separate counters. Now these two counter values are slightly different at the end of a constant time period of counting. Why? Because they are being counted at different rates. And then when you compare them, you find that one has a higher risk, one is a higher value and the other has a lower value, and these two choices are encoded in two different response bits 0 or 1 by this comparator. Now, so the comparison of frequency of two oscillators is the primary primary way this ring oscillator works, principle behind the working of this ring oscillators. Okay. The connectivity of the ring oscillators to the two multiplexers are different. The permutations are different. That's why two different oscillators are chosen when you apply the same challenge. The disadvantage of this is the exponential hardware overhead, right? Because here you require 2 power n number of oscillators and two very large multiplexers. Okay, so if your n is say 10 or so, you will require 1024 2 power 10 ring oscillators. We have actually designed up to 10 bit challenge ring oscillators. It's a nightmare actually. It is very difficult to go above 10. Even 10 is too much. Probably 7 to 8 probably is okay, but it generates a lot of power. It is very power hungry. It is area expensive. So it is slightly difficult, but it is also susceptible to attacks, and one of the attacks I will describe next. But it is more resistant to direct SVM type of machine learning modeling attacks. So let's see an attack on a ring oscillator puff. Okay, so our data set consists of 5 different ring oscillator puffs, each with 7-bit inputs. So these are small puffs, and there was an artificial puff which was the majority voting of these 5 outputs. Okay, so what I mean by majority voting is that if 3 or more are 1, then the output will be 1, or otherwise it will be 0. So something like this. So say for example, this was the majority voted puff, and these were the 5 different actual hardware puffs. Now we decided to apply genetic programming, which is a evolutionary computing technique to model this puff circuits. Okay, so here what we will do is we will generate random binary expression trees with Boolean operators and members, and the logic expressions that can be derived by traversing these binary expression trees. Okay, by traversing them in order, and then the goal is to generate Boolean expressions which best represent the recorded truth table of the ring oscillator puffs that we have. So I will give you examples with diagrams of what I mean, but basic functions we will support are AND and OR, 2 input AND and 2 input OR, and either variables or their negations. So basically we are supporting the fundamental 3 different operators AND, OR, and NOT. Input sizes can be 100 to 1000. Reproduction schemes are elitist and tournament selection. I'll come to that. Mutation also I'll come. So let's see what it means. There is some text. I just skipped over the text. I think the diagrams will give us better representation. So suppose I generate a random expression tree which looks like this. So this is a Boolean expression tree. OK, all of you probably know operator based expression trees, arithmetic operator based expression trees are possible, but these are binary logic operator based expression trees. Now at the leaf nodes, you have the variables. There are 7 variables. Remember, these are 7 input puffs. I call these variables A, B, C, D, E, F, G. And here some of the variables are the complements of the some of the input. For example, not of A, not of B, etc. Okay, so here we have a tree which I called parent 1. These straight line kind of operators are Boolean OR, the ampersand are Boolean AND the this exclamation signs mean the Boolean complement. Now the second parent is another tree. Of course, it looks different from the first tree. I call it the parent 2. And it also has a structure. It is more unbalanced. The first one was kind of more balanced tree, but this is more unbalanced, but still it is a binary tree. Now, of these 2 parents, I select portions, subtrees, which are going to be exchanged. This entire subtrees are going to be swapped between the 2 parents to give rise to 2 different trees. So the portions shaded in pink here and the portion shaded in pink here are shown. This will be swapped. Now, additionally, in the parent 2, one particular location, one particular node, which had an AND operator has been chosen for mutation. In mutation, in real genetics, mutation happens is a sudden change in the genetic constitution of an organism. It can happen when there is high radioactivity. It can happen when there is an infection from a virus. It can happen when you get exposed to some chemical in many different ways. It can happen if the weather suddenly changes drastically. All these things can happen. It can be good or it can be bad. Most cases it is bad, but sometimes it can also be good. Now this mutation location is chosen randomly, and whether mutation will happen or not, that also is probabilistic. How probabilistic is this? That it is probabilistic is the probability of mutation happening is something like 0.001. So it very low probability, 1 in 1,000 that one node will suddenly change. And then you cross over between these 2 parents. You reproduce between them so that their genetic material is exchanged, just like it happens in biological reproduction, where the child gets some of its genes from the father and some of its genes from the mother. So then you get child 1 after crossover, and this child looks something like this, where the right hand side is obtained from this guy, the parent 1, and the left hand side is has been obtained from the parent 2, and then the child 2, its right hand side is primarily from parent 2, and the left hand side has been obtained from parent 1. So now you have this 2 new individuals, and by traversing these trees, you will get 2 different Boolean expressions, logic expressions, right? So these are 2 different Boolean functions that you represent. Now I iteratively perform this again and again, not only once, but I generate a large population, pairwise kind of randomly select them and reproduce between them, and I get a new generation. Now, what is an elitist model? The elitist model, in any generation, the top rank 50% of members. How do I rank the members? Well, the members have to be compared with what you want. You want the truth table of a particular puff instance. There were 5 such puff instances, but just consider one of them. You want the truth table of one puff instance. Okay, and the top rank 50%. You of any generation, you say that no, these are they are truth table. Why are they top rank? Because their truth tables have very nicely matched the truth tables that the target truth table. Okay, that's why it's of course it does not perfectly match probably, but it is very nicely matched, or it is closely matched. So you take top rank 50% of such members and they are progressed to the next generation. The remaining 50% of the generation is now they reproduce among themselves by random partner selection, and then you generate another 50% of the population and push to the next generation. So iteratively these computations keep on happening in the elitist model. In the tournament selection model, it happens as it happens in tennis tournaments, where it is usually like say Wimbledon or something, where you pair up the players and only the winner goes to the next round. OK, now half the population moves to the next round and the remaining half of the loser population is again selected, and they are reproduced to generate the remaining half of the population to go to the next round. In tennis tournaments, what happened? It's a 7-round tournament like say Wimbledon. You start with 128 players, and at every round, half of the players are eliminated. OK, so second round you have only 64 players left. Third round you have only 32 players left. Fourth round you have only 16 players left. Quarter final 8 players, etc. Finally, final 2 players. Now here you do not allow the total size of the population to decrease. So 50% of the population you choose the winners, OK, as in a tennis tournament. But 50% of the population you reproduce from among the losers, OK, to generate new individuals. So this is natural selection. This is what happens. What happens in nature. That's one of the theories of evolution, that natural selection selects individuals which have good genetic constitution, and the individuals which have bad genetic constitution gradually die down. OK, so this is how you kind of simulate that, and then you run several iterations of this until your performance no longer decreases, or you set a limit on the number of generations. So this is an example for the different paths averaged. For elitist and tournament selection, 2 different models, we produced about 84% accuracy, prediction accuracy. OK, these were 7-bit paths, 128 challenge response pairs, of which 25% was used for as training set. OK. Or I think 3/4 was, because these are small pups. Let me just. Yeah, training was with 32. Sorry, 1/4 of the total data set. Total this. Truth tables. OK, so with that you obtained about 82-83% accuracy over 10 generations. Not necessarily that if you increase the generations, I mean, well, it increases, the accuracy increases, but if you look at the elitist model, beyond generation 7, the accuracy hasn't increased at all. OK, so and in some cases there is slight degradation compared to the previous generation, but it quickly corrects. This is called genetic drift. This had happened between generation number 5 and 6 in the elitist model, but then it quickly corrects, but then it becomes static. There isn't much improvement, even if you increase the number of generations. So that's what we obtained. So interestingly, this 82 or whatever 83% result was obtained primarily for PUF6, which was an artificial PUF out of the majority voting of the 5 types of PUFs. For some of the PUFs, the accuracy results were not good. For example, PUF1, PUF3 and PUF5, the accuracy results were something like 68%, which is probably not very good. PUF4 was OK, around 78% accuracy, but PUF6 was above 80%. OK, so just to give you an idea, see, in different domains of machine learning, what is good prediction accuracy is varies. in the PAF domain, if the prediction accuracy is less than 90%, it is not considered that good. Okay, so for example, modern deep learning based techniques have come in the recent past. In the recent past means say in the last 2-3 months, where much more accuracy is obtained. I mean, close to 100% accuracy is obtained. Even basic arbiter PAF can be have 100% accuracy using simple technique like SVM. Okay, so if the initial population size is large, accuracy is better. For example, it goes back to 84%. And the tournament selection models takes more time to run, but the elitist model takes less time, but it has less accuracy also. For standard functions, this technique actually has very good accuracy. Okay, so I want to learn an AND function or an OR function, 8 input AND or OR functions, I can learn it with more than 90% accuracy, and 92% in case of AND and 94% in case of OR. XOR obtained about 86% accuracy. Basically, we are trying to learn Boolean functions through evolutionary computing in this. So that's kind of the end of my talk today.